A bleeding stranger fell against the Undertaker's door, gasping, "Bury the others." The door was made of pine, and it had a particular sound when a man's body hit it. Not a knock, not a fist, the sound of something heavy and wet losing its argument with gravity and choosing the nearest vertical surface to finish losing it against. I'd heard that sound before twice in 30 years, men shot or broken who made it far enough to find my door before they stopped making it anywhere. So when I heard it, I was already moving, had the lamp off the table before I was upright. Old habit. You don't walk toward an unknown sound in the dark, with your face lit up like a target. I opened it and he fell in. He was a big man. Would have been bigger a few hours earlier before whatever happened to him happened. He came down across my threshold, half inside and half on the boards of the porch, and the smell hit me first, iron and sweat and something else I recognized as creek water, cold and black-bottomed, the kind that comes from high up in the hills. He'd crossed water somewhere. His coat was soaked through below the waist. I got down beside him and turned him on his back, and he was breathing. Ragged and shallow, but breathing. He'd been shot at least twice, once in the left side below the ribs and once through the meat of his right thigh, and both wounds were plugged with what looked like torn shirt, his own shirt, the fabric dark and stiff with old blood. He'd been doing that himself, then, somewhere on the trail. A man who could still manage that much had some want left in him. He opened his eyes. Brown, shot through with yellow at the edges, the way eyes go when a man's been running on nothing but will and fear for too long. He said, "Bury the others." That was all, his eyes closed. I got my hands under his arms and dragged him the rest of the way inside and kicked the door shut behind us. My name is Elias Cutter. I have been an undertaker in the town of Harlan, Kansas since 1871, which puts me at 22 years in the trade as of the autumn this happened. I took it up because a man had to take something up, and because I came back from the war with no particular fear of the dead and no great love for the living, and the job suited both those facts about me without asking me to explain either one. I was 44 years old. I lived alone in the back half of the building I worked in. The front half was my workshop and display room, 3 pine boxes on sawhorses, a 4th in progress. My tools hung along the west wall in the order I used them. The smell of wood shavings and linseed oil had worked itself into the plaster of every room, and I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the sound a house makes when it settles at night. Harlan was not a large town. 70-some souls, growing slower than it thought it would when the first settlers staked it out in '67. A dry goods, a bank, a livery, 2 saloons, a church that shared its building with the schoolroom on weekdays, a doctor who came through on Thursdays, and me. A barber named Finch who doubled as the deputy when the sheriff was elsewhere, which was most of the time. A land agent. A few dozen families spread out in the surrounding country, ranchers and their people. I was known in Harlan. That is the most I'll say. Known, not liked or disliked with much heat, not counted among the men whose opinions shaped anything, not the kind of man women smiled at when he passed on the boardwalk. Known, the way a post office is known. You go there when you need it. Otherwise, you don't think about it much. That had been my arrangement with the town for a long time, and I'd made my peace with it, or told myself I had. There's a difference between those two things, and for a long time I was not honest enough with myself to know it. The man on my floor was named Dex Galloway, and I learned this 3 days later when he was conscious long enough to say so. In between, I did what I could. I'd had some field dressing in the war, not a surgeon, nothing like that, but enough exposure to the inside of men's bodies that I knew the difference between a wound that was going to kill someone and one that wasn't if it was kept clean. The thigh was ugly but manageable. The side was worse. The ball had gone through clean, which was the good news. The bad news was that something, probably the crossing of cold water, probably lying somewhere in the wet dark before he made it to my door, had started a chill in him that by the second night had him shaking hard enough to rattle the cot he was on. I kept the wood stove hot. I boiled rags and packed the wounds and did it again when they needed doing again. I made broth from a ham bone I'd been saving and got some of it into him when he was half awake enough to swallow. I didn't sleep much. I'd done without sleep before and I knew how to manage it. You take it in pieces, 15 or 20 minutes at a stretch, the way a scout does, your ear always up. On the second night, around 3 in the morning, he started talking in his fever. Names mostly. A name that sounded like Curtis, and a woman's name I couldn't make out, and something about a creek, which told me he was running that crossing over and over in his head the way men do when something happened at a place, and the mind keeps returning to settle the account. I didn't try to make sense of it. I'd heard fever talk before. What I did was, I sat in the chair beside the cot and kept him from throwing off the blanket, which he tried to do every half hour with the conviction of a man who has decided that the blanket itself is the source of all his troubles. That was the second night. On the third day he was coherent. He told me his name. He told me he'd come from a place called Roper's Creek, which was a settlement about 30 miles north and east, up into the hill country, a place I'd heard of but never had occasion to visit. He told me he was a drover, originally, and that he'd been working for a rancher up there named Durant for the past year and a half. He stopped there and looked at the ceiling for a while. The others, he said, I told you to bury the others. You said that, I told him. First thing you said, but you were in no condition to explain it and I was in no condition to make a 30-mile ride on the information I had. He looked at me then. The yellow had receded some from his eyes. He was still the color of old tallow, but there was something behind the color now, a presence, a man thinking. How long, he said. 3 days. He closed his eyes. Christ. How many, I said. 4. He opened his eyes again. Durant and 3 of his hands. Ambush on the north pasture. Copley's men, Frank Copley, he's been wanting Durant's range for 2 years. He finally just took it. He paused. I was supposed to be with them. I had gone back to the barn for a cinch that was cutting. When I heard the shooting he stopped, pressed his lips together. There were 8 of them. Against 4. Against 5 if I'd been there. He said it flat, not like he was arguing the math, more like a man who has put a stone in his pocket and intends to carry it. You were hit, I said. While I was running. He said that flat too. One caught me in the leg before I got into the trees. The side that was later when I tried to circle around. I thought I could. He stopped again. I couldn't. I poured water into a cup and handed it to him and he drank. Durant had a wife, he said after a while. Clara Durant, she'll need to know. You know her. Rancher's widow she'll be now. He handed the cup back. She's a good woman, one of the best I've known. She deserves to hear it from someone who was there, not from a county sheriff who wasn't. I said I would ride out to Roper's Creek when I had him stable enough to leave. He said, I appreciate that. We didn't talk much more that day. But toward evening, when I brought him broth and he'd gotten some of his color back, he looked around my workshop with its boxes on sawhorses and he said, You do all right in your trade. I told him it depended on what you meant by all right. He said, I meant it as a compliment. I said I knew and I thanked him. It was another 4 days before I felt right about leaving him. His fever had broken proper by then, and he was eating, and the wound in his side was closed clean with no sign of corruption. The thigh was going to be a while yet. The ball had done something to the muscle that was going to make his walking uncertain for some months. But he was alive, and when a man is alive and healing you start thinking about what comes next. What came next was Roper's Creek. I told Dex Galloway I was going. He asked if he could come. I told him no, not yet, and he gave me the look a man gives you when he knows you're right but resents it nonetheless. I told him where I kept the food and told him not to put weight on the leg, and I told the barber Finch where I was going, which was not something I usually did. But 4 men dead in a mass killing by Frank Copley's riders was the kind of thing a town's deputy ought to know about, even if he was mostly just a barber. Finch said Copley, Lord. I said I knew. I left before dawn. It was mid-October and the cold came down hard off the plains at night and hadn't fully let go yet by the time the sun was up. My horse, a gray roan gelding I'd had for 9 years, and to whom I'd given no name because, in my experience, naming an animal leads to a particular kind of grief you could have easily avoided. He moved well in the cold, better than in the heat. We made decent time on the road north. I had a wagon behind me with pine boards and my tools. I hadn't done a mass burial of this kind before, but I'd done plenty of single men, and I didn't imagine the arithmetic changed much. You multiply what you know. The hills came up gradually. The grass went from the flat yellow of the plains to something taller and coarser, bent in a wind that smelled of pine from the higher country. By early afternoon I could see the buildings of what I took to be Durrant's ranch. A main house, 2 outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, all of it solid and well built, the look of a man who'd put money and care into his land over time. There was smoke from the main house chimney. I pulled up in the yard and waited. That's what you do. You don't announce yourself by walking up to a door on a property where bad things have recently happened. You let the house decide whether to come to you. The door opened after about a minute. A woman came out onto the porch. She was perhaps 38-40, dark hair pulled back tight. She was wearing a canvas work apron over a dark dress, and she had both hands in the apron pockets, and she stood on the top step of that porch and looked at me the way a woman looks at a stranger when she's already had the worst news and isn't sure what kind of news you are. Clara Durrant, I said. Yes, she said. Who are you? I told her my name. I told her what I did. I told her about Dex Galloway coming to my door. She listened to all of it without changing her expression. When I was finished, she stood there a moment with her hands still in her pockets, and then she said, Come inside. The inside of the Durrant house was the kind of house that gets made when someone has been living in it for a long time and is not pretending to be anywhere else. The furniture was worn and solid. There was a quilt on the back of the settee that had been mended in 4 places, and the mending was neat. The stove was big, the kind you need for a house that has to stay warm through a Kansas winter with nobody coming and going to help keep the wood supply up. She poured coffee and set it on the table without asking if I wanted any, which I found I appreciated. She sat across from me. He told you about my husband, she said. He told me what happened. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Frank Copley came here himself yesterday, told me there'd been an accident, said some of Durrant's men had gotten into a dispute on the range and shot each other and that Durrant had been caught in the middle of it. She paused. He said he was sorry for my loss. What did you say? I said thank you and closed the door. She looked at me. I grew up on a ranch. I know what a dispute between hired men looks like, and I know what an ambush looks like. And I know that Frank Copley has been trying to get this land for 2 years, and I know that my husband told him to his face last spring that it wasn't for sale at any price, not for twice what it was worth, not for 3 times, not for the moon. She picked up her cup. I knew when I saw his face at my door what kind of sorry he was. She drank, I drank. She said, Where are they? I was hoping you could tell me that. Galloway said the north pasture. She nodded. I'll take you. I said she didn't have to, and she looked at me with an expression that said she knew she didn't have to, and that wasn't the point. The 4 men were where Galloway had said they'd be, in the north pasture by a stock pond. There was a windmill there, one of its blades broken, slowly grinding. The cottonwoods along the pond's edge had gone yellow and were dropping their leaves in the wind. Clara Durrant stood at the fence line while I worked. She didn't look away. I want to say that because some people think a woman looking away is the appropriate thing, the decent thing. It isn't always. Sometimes the decent thing is to stand there and witness it and let the dead know someone is still paying attention to them. I worked through the afternoon and into the early evening. By the time I had them loaded and decent, the sun was low and orange behind a bank of cloud and the wind had picked up. I pulled the wagon back to the yard, and she came alongside without being asked, and we did the rest of it together, quietly, each doing what needed doing. When it was finished, she said, "Stay the night. It's a long ride back and you've done a long day's work." I told her I didn't need to impose. She said it isn't an imposition. I'd rather have someone in the house. There was no sentiment in the way she said it. It was a practical statement. A widow who just buried her husband and 3 of her people, alone on a ranch 30 miles from the nearest town, saying she'd rather have someone in the house. It was not a complicated thing she was asking. I said yes. She made supper from what was in her larder, salt pork and dried beans and cornbread and more coffee. We ate at the kitchen table, and she told me about the ranch, matter-of-factly, the way someone talks about a thing they've been thinking about how to hold onto. The herd was wintered on the south pasture, 38 head, good stock. The water rights were in her husband's name and hers jointly, which her husband had done deliberately because he'd seen what happened to widows whose names weren't on the paper. The land itself, same. There was money in the bank in Harlan, she told me. She wasn't sure how much, but enough for a winter. The problem was the spring. The problem was the work. I said that made sense. She said, "I'm not telling you this because I want you to fix it. I'm telling you because it's in my head, and it helps me to say it out loud to someone who isn't trying to buy it from me." I said I understood. She looked at me. "What do you do," she said, "when you're not burying people?" I thought about that. "I make the boxes," I said. "There's woodwork involved, joinery, some carving when people ask for it." I read. I stopped. "That's about it, I suppose." "Do you like it?" "The work?" "Living alone, being what you are in a town?" I was quiet for a moment. "I don't know anyone who asked me that before," I said. "I'm asking." I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. "There are days I think it suits me," I said. "And there are days I know I'm lying to myself and it's just the easiest answer." I picked up my cup. "I've been on my own a long time. You get used to the shape of your own life after a while. The edges stop feeling sharp." She nodded slowly. "Thomas used to say something like that, before we were married. He said he'd gotten used to being alone and he was afraid that was permanent." "What changed it?" She looked at me, half a smile in one corner of her mouth. "I didn't give him the option of staying used to it." I slept in the bunkhouse. In the morning I had coffee and she had it ready before I was properly awake, which told me she'd been up before the dawn, which told me about her night. We didn't talk much over coffee. There wasn't the need to. I told her I'd see to the matter of burying her husband and his men properly in Harlan, that there was a cemetery there that was decent, or if she wanted them on her land I could do that too. She said on the land. She said Thomas would have wanted to be where he could see the pasture. I told her I'd come back for that, when the ground permitted. She walked me out to the wagon. The morning was bright and cold, the kind that makes everything look cut out of something. She stood in the yard while I hitched up the roan, and when I was ready to go, she came to the side of the wagon and put her hand on the seat rail and looked up at me. "Elias," she said. It was the first time she'd used my given name. "Tell Dex Galloway that I'm glad he's alive," she said. "Tell him Thomas would have wanted to know he made it." I said I would. She looked at me for a moment, steady, the way she'd looked at everything since I'd arrived, not soft, not hard, just honest. "Thank you," she said, "for coming up here, for doing what you did." She paused. "I could tell you'd done a long day's work and you still did it right. That matters." I didn't know what to say to that. I said she was welcome and I meant it. She stepped back and I started the wagon, and when I looked back from the first bend in the road, she was still standing in the yard, watching me go, her hands in her pockets again the way they'd been on the porch when I arrived. I told Galloway all of it when I got back. He'd been up and moving carefully around my shop in my absence, which I'd expected, and he'd swept the floor, which I hadn't. He sat in the chair I used for talking to families and listened to the whole account with the attention of a man who has been lying still for a week and is grateful to be receiving information from the outside world. When I told him what Clara Durant had said about Thomas wanting to know he'd made it, he looked at the floor for a while. "Good woman," he said. "I told her that," I said. He looked up. "What else did you tell her?" "Nothing that needed to be unsaid." He studied me. He had those yellow-shot eyes, Dex Galloway, and when he studied you, you knew it. "She did all right," he said. "She did better than all right," I said. "She did what needed doing." Galloway stayed 3 more weeks, through the first hard frost of the season. He walked on the leg before he should have, but I'd figured he would, and I didn't argue it past the first time. He helped me in the shop some, learning the joinery by watching and then by doing, which he was not bad at once he got the feel for the planer. He was a particular kind of company, Galloway, not a man who needed to fill silence, which I respected, and not one who let silence go awkward, which I also respected. We ate at the same table and split the work of the house and spoke when we had something to say, and that was the whole of it. He left on a Thursday, going east toward his sister's place in Missouri, which was where he'd always meant to end up eventually, and which the business with Durant's ranch had accelerated. He shook my hand at the door. "You're a good man to have needed," he said. It was an odd way to put it. I've thought about it since, and I think he meant it exactly right. I made the ride back to Clara Durant's in November, when the ground was hard but not yet iron, which is the right window. I brought my tools and lumber and 2 men I'd hired on short notice from Harlan, Finch's nephew, and a hand from a neighboring spread who needed the work. 3 days to do what needed doing right. She'd prepared for us. The bunkhouse was swept out and aired, firewood stacked inside the door, a pot of something on the stove when we arrived. She directed us to where she wanted the markers, on the rise at the south edge of the east pasture, looking out over the land the way she'd said Thomas would have wanted. She'd marked it herself with stakes. We worked those 3 days through weather that kept threatening snow without delivering it. She was in and out, doing her own work on the ranch, keeping the place turning. I'd see her crossing the yard with a bucket, or coming out of the barn with the look of someone who's been solving a problem, or standing at the fence with her arms crossed looking at the cattle in the way ranchers look at cattle, not seeing individual animals but seeing numbers, health, the weight of winter ahead. On the second evening she asked me to walk with her. We went out to the rise where the markers stood in the cold low light, not crosses. She'd chosen plain stones from the creek bed, and she stood beside her husband's marker for a while without saying anything. I stood a little to the side and didn't crowd her and didn't rush her. She said, "I keep thinking about what this place will be in 5 years." "What do you think it'll be?" I said. "Whatever I make it." She said it without bravado, just the arithmetic of it. "I didn't come here to give it up to Frank Copley or anyone else." She turned to look at me. "Thomas and I built this together. I know every inch of it. I know what it can be." She paused. "People in town think a widow on her own out here can't hold it. I've heard it already." "People in towns think whatever's easiest," I said. She looked at me with something shifting in her expression, something that had been held still by the weight of the last weeks moving a little. "You're not from here originally," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Ohio," I said, "long time ago." "What brought you to Harlan?" "The war brought me to Kansas," I said. "Harlan was where I stopped." "Is it where you wanted to stop?" I thought about it. The honest answer was that I hadn't wanted anything much when I stopped, that I'd been moving with the momentum of a man who'd survived things he hadn't expected to survive and hadn't quite figured out what to do with the surplus time. I stopped meaning to move on eventually, I said. 22 years it becomes permanent without announcing itself. She nodded. Does it suit you? I'd had that question once before, from her. It suits me differently than it did, I said. I think things can do that. She held my eyes for a moment, then looked back at the markers. Thank you for doing this right, she said. All of it. The work you did, and the way you did it. It's what I do. It's more than that, and you know it, she said quietly, and the way she said it landed on a place in me I'd thought was walled off. Not with sentiment. She wasn't a sentimental woman. She said it the way you say a true thing, plainly, without decoration, because the truth doesn't need it. I went back to Harlan and I went back to my work, and for a few weeks it was the same as before. The same and not the same. I noticed things I hadn't noticed, or hadn't let myself notice. The sound the shop made at night. The fact that when I sat down to eat I was sitting down to eat alone. The fact that I'd gotten so accustomed to this that I'd mistaken accustomed for content. The way you can mistake a man who stopped arguing for a man who's at peace. Finch came in one afternoon in early December, not for professional services, just to talk, which he did sometimes in the slow part of the year, when the barbershop was empty and the cold kept people indoors. He asked about the Durant situation, whether I thought Copley would move on the widow. I said I thought he'd try. He asked what I thought would happen if he did. I said I thought Copley had made a serious error in his estimate of Clara Durant. Finch looked at me for a moment with that look barbers get, the one they develop from years of watching faces in the mirror. He said, "You went up there twice." I said yes. He said, "Undertakers don't generally go back to the same job twice." I told him the job wasn't finished after the first trip. He said, "I see," and I told him he didn't see anything, and he smiled the way barbers smile when they've seen exactly what they were looking for. I rode up to Roper's Creek again in January, in weather that had no business being crossed in a wagon, which is why I went on horseback and brought very little with me. I told myself I was checking on the land situation, on whether Copley had made any move, which was a true reason if not the whole of it. She was in the barn when I arrived, which I could see from the yard, lamplight coming through the gap in the door, and I tied the roan at the post and went to the barn door and knocked on the frame. "Come in," she said. She was at the far end, tending to a mare that had a wrapped foreleg. She looked up when I came in, and a thing crossed her face that I'm not going to try to name, except to say it wasn't unfriendly. She looked back at the mare. "I didn't expect you," she said. "I was going to send a letter," I said. "Rode up instead." "In this weather." "The road was all right," I said, which was half true. She looked up at me again. There was lamplight across her face, and her hands were doing their work on the wrap without needing her eyes, the practiced competence of someone who's done this particular thing many times. "Is there news?" she said. "About Copley?" "He's been quiet," I said. "I don't know what that means." "It usually means he's thinking." "Yes," I said. "That's my read too." She finished the wrap and gave the mare's neck a pat and straightened up and turned to me. She had her coat on over her dress, and her hair was loose from whatever she'd tied it with at the start of the day, one dark piece of it falling across her cheekbone. "You didn't ride 30 miles in January to tell me Copley's been quiet," she said. "No," I said. She waited. I am not a man who's had a great deal of practice saying what I mean to say. I spent 22 years in a town as a man who was known but not much known, and that arrangement had suited me in the way I described to her, the way things suit you when you've stopped expecting better. I'd forgotten, for a long time, what it felt like to be in a room with someone and feel the shape of the room change. I said I thought about what you asked me, both times, whether the life I have suits me. She said nothing. "I've been thinking," I said, "that a man can be honest with himself about a thing and still not know what to do about it. He can know that what he has isn't what he'd choose, if choosing were on offer. And he can go on like that for a long time because going on is easier than admitting that he'd choose something different, because admitting that means hoping, and hope has a way of making a man feel foolish. The mare shifted. The lamp swung a little in a draft from somewhere. Clara Durrant looked at me with those steady eyes, the same look she'd had on the porch the first time, the same look she'd had at the markers in the cold. Measuring, not harsh, just honest. "What would you choose," she said, "if choosing were on offer?" "I'd choose to be near a person who looked at me the way you look at things," I said, "like they're worth knowing." It came out plainer than I'd planned, but I think she was not a woman who would have wanted it any other way. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about you too, Elias." She crossed the barn toward me, and what she did was, she put her hand against the side of my face. Both of us cold from the January air and her hand warm from working, and she held it there and looked at me and said, "I'm not in a hurry. I'm not about to pretend the last months haven't happened or that I know what comes next, but I think you're a good man. I think I know what kind, which is the part that matters." She paused. "I think you're the kind that's easier to see up close." I put my hand over hers. Her knuckles were rough from work and her palm was warm, and she didn't pull away. "I'm not asking for anything," I said. "I know," she said. "I'm not either. I'm just saying what's true." We stood like that for a little while in a cold barn in January, a mare watching us with large, brown, patient eyes, the lamp swinging, the sound of wind against the boards. "I want to tell you about Copley, because you're wondering." He moved in February, the way I'd expected, a visit to the bank in Harlan, a conversation with the land agent, the particular kind of paperwork that men like Frank Copley use as a weapon before they get to the other kind. He filed a claim disputing the water rights on 2 sections adjacent to Durrant's north pasture, which didn't touch the house or the main range but was a piece of maneuvering, a pressure point, the first move in what he intended to be a longer game. Finch told me about it the same day it happened. I rode up to Roper's Creek that week and sat at the kitchen table with Clara and explained what I understood of it, which was not nothing. I'd spent 20 years dealing with the county seat on behalf of families, understanding deed transfers and property questions, the language of it. She listened and asked precise questions. When I'd finished, she said, "What do I need?" I said she needed a lawyer with more legal standing than I had, but that I knew a man in Wichita who dealt with water rights cases before and who was honest, which in that line of work was rare enough to be worth mentioning. She said to write the letter. I wrote it. She went to Wichita in March and came back with documentation that made Copley's claim about as solid as smoke, because her husband had been careful with the paperwork from the beginning, and because she was the kind of person who knew exactly where every piece of paper was kept and what it meant. I went with her to Wichita. She didn't ask me to, I offered. She looked at me for a moment when I offered and then said yes. We were there 3 days. We ate at a place that had tablecloths, and she looked at the tablecloths like they were a slight absurdity, and I told her she looked fine, and she told me she'd rather be wearing her work apron, and I told her she'd look fine in that too. And something between us shifted from the careful distance we'd been keeping to something else, something warmer and less careful, and I was glad for it in a way that felt like something thawing that had been frozen a long time. On the second evening she said, "I talked to Thomas about you." I said, "Thomas is." "I know," she said. "I still talk to him about things that matter." She looked at her coffee cup. "I told him you were a good man. I told him I thought he'd have liked you." She paused. "He was not a jealous man. He was a man who wanted me to be all right." She looked up. "I think he'd want this, whatever this is." I said I thought this was us being honest with each other. She said, "Yes, that's what I think too." Spring came the way Kansas springs come, fast and violent, thunderstorms every 3 days in April, the ground turning green almost overnight, the smell of everything waking up at once. I was back and forth to Roper's Creek often enough through those months that my neighbors in Harlan had formed their opinions and were keeping them more or less to themselves, which for Harlan passed as discretion. Finch said to me in April, "You look different." And I told him I wasn't different, and he said, "All right," in the tone that means the conversation isn't over, it's just moved. I thought about Galloway sometimes, about the thing he'd said when he left, about being a good man to have needed. I turned that over in my head more than once. There is a kind of life where a man makes himself useful in a contained way, an appointed function, a defined perimeter, and within that perimeter he is reliable and skilled and can be counted on. I'd had that life. It had a dignity to it. But there's another thing, which is being needed by a specific person, a chosen person, because of who you are and not just what you do, and that's the thing I'd been out of reach of for a long time without quite letting myself know it. I think she knew I needed to come to it on my own schedule. I think she let me. I asked her in May, which I'll say plainly because the story wants you to know. We were on the rise at the east pasture in the evening, the light going low across the grass, and she'd said something about the herd and the summer pasture arrangement, and whether to take on a hand for the season. And we'd been talking about it the way you talk about things when your life is interleaved with someone else's, and both of you know it, and neither of you has said it in the particular words. I said, "I've been thinking about the practical matter of all this." She looked at me. "What practical matter?" "The back and forth," I said. "The 30 miles, the winter when it comes again." She held my eyes. "I could work from here," I said. "There's not much about my work that requires me to be in a particular building. I could maintain the business in Harlan without." I stopped. "I'm not saying what I mean to say." "No," she said, "you're not." I said, "Clara, I would like this to be the same life, yours and mine. I've had a long run of good solitude and I know its value, but I know the difference now between that and what this is. And I don't want to keep riding back to Harlan and lying in the same room I've had for 20 years and knowing that this is here." I said, "I'm asking if you'd have me." She was quiet for a moment. The grass moved. Somewhere below us on the pasture, a calf bawled for its mother, and the mother answered. She said, "I thought you were never going to stop circling it." I said I was working up to it. She said, "I know you were." And she reached over and took my hand, the two of us sitting on that rise with the evening coming down, and she held it the way you hold something you mean to keep. "Yes, Elias," she said, "I would have you. There are things I could tell you about the practical shape of the life that followed, the way we managed the property and the business and the ranch between us, the way Harlan eventually adjusted its understanding of who I was, the way Copley had 2 more encounters with Clara Durrant's lawyer over the next 4 years and lost both of them, the way Dex Galloway sent a letter from Missouri when he heard that said only, "About time." The way a new bunkhouse hand named Ortega came on in the summer and turned out to be the kind of man who became part of the place instead of just passing through it. I could tell you those things, but they're the after part, and what I want you to understand is the before part and the moment between them. The moment between them was this. A man who had spent 22 years being useful in a defined way, who had made his peace with the shape of his life, and called that peace contentment, and was mostly wrong about that but had run out of the energy to notice. That man had a bleeding stranger fall against his door in October and say 3 words, and those 3 words sent him 30 miles into the hill country, and in that hill country a woman looked at him as though looking at him carefully was worth her time. She looked at me that way every day after, the way you look at something you've decided is worth knowing, worth keeping your eyes on, not with worship. She was not a worshiping kind of woman, and I wouldn't have wanted that anyway. Just with that quality of attention that says, "I see you, I've chosen you, I'm not confused about it." There are men who live their whole lives without being seen that plainly by another person. I was one of them for a long time. And then I wasn't. Last thing I'll say. There's a morning habit she has. Before the full light, when the ranch is just beginning to move, she comes to wherever I am, the kitchen, the barn, once the doorway of the workshop I've built off the back of the house. And she stands beside me and doesn't say anything, just stands there, her shoulder against my arm, watching what I'm watching, both of us in the same direction. She started doing it early, and I never said a word about it because I didn't want to break the spell of it. I just stood there and felt the warmth of her beside me, and the particular quality of quiet that a person who's chosen to be there gives a room. I'm 61 years old. I've been an undertaker for 30-some years, and I've had my time with the dead and made my peace with the fact that everything ends, and for a long time that knowledge sat in me like a stone. It still sits there. But there is a morning light on this prairie that comes in flat and gold off the flats and catches the grass just right, and she stands beside me in it, and the stone doesn't feel the way it used to. That's the whole of it. That's what I have to tell you. A bleeding stranger fell against my door and said, "Bury the others," and I did. And along the way, I got buried myself, in a manner of speaking, buried in a life I hadn't known to want. A good woman made sure of that. I'm grateful for it every morning. Every one.